I'm Mary Schmitt with Cayuse Western Americana, and I've got with me today Dr. Ken Barrick, who's written a brand new biography on Harrison Crandall, otherwise known as Hank, a great early 20th century photographer of Grand Teton National Park. Welcome.
Well, hello.
Hello.
Pleased to be here.
Pleased to be here.
Always pleased to chat about Harrison Crandall, too.
Oh, wonderful. Well, that makes me want to ask you first and foremost, what brought you to Grand Teton National Park the first time?
The first time to the park was probably 40 years ago when I discovered the greater Yellowstone Grand Teton Park area. Fell in love, just like Hank Crandall and his family did, and have been coming back in the summer ever since.
Okay, so when did you first discover Crandall?
Well, that's an interesting story. I've been a national park art collector for many years. Started collecting when Jack and Susan Davis, Bozeman, Montana, great antique dealers and park art.
Yep.
In fact, your show, and you and your mother's show up in Bozeman is one of the important starting points many years ago. And I became interested in all kinds of park art. And eventually then I went to one of the Davis's shows and found two of Hank Crandall's hand-painted photograph panels, as he called them. Mm-hmm. Fell in love with those immediately because they were so distinctly different.
Were they flowers or what?
They were flowers.
Okay.
It was the wild rose and the gentian, which is the official park flower of Yellowstone Park.
Okay, so you remember the first two, the names?
Absolutely. I remember the moment. I can see it all in slow motion. But because I had been photographing wildflowers myself all through the Rocky Mountains for many, many years before that, and I knew how difficult it was to hold a flower still in the wind and get a close-up picture and just get it right. It's a huge job, and every photographer who's ever tried it knows that.
Right,
so I already appreciated that photography, the detail in the picture itself. But then the hand painting was very distinctly different than any I'd ever seen in the many years that I've been collecting the old hand-painted photographs before color films had been developed. And Hank's photos jump at you. They're bold and bright and opaque, whereas most people, in fact, everybody else was doing transparent watercolor type tinting.
Right, right.
So when Hank developed here in the Tetons the technique of actually using the photographic paper like a canvas and putting the opaque oils over it, it makes a very striking image.
Right.
And that's what really got me to immediately have to buy those two wildflower panels. And then there was a little logo on the bottom that said Crandall Teton Park. And Teton Park, of course, excited me already.
Right,
but
right.
then who was Crandall? I hadn't heard that name before at that point.
Did Jack and Susan have any enlightenment for you at that time?
Just a little bit. And everyone I asked, they told me he was a photographer in the Tetons. But of course, being a researcher, you're always trying to dig deeper. What was the life? When did they do their work? And so, but I couldn't find out much. Wasn't even much detail on the internet at the time. And so I called the park curator here at the Grand Teton National Park one day thinking that I might do some research in the Tetons that summer. And I said, well, I could do one of two projects if you would like me to. Always like my work to be relevant to the parks that I love so much. So she said, sure. Well, I said, what do you want to do? I said, well, I could either do Harrison Crandall or I could do the Civilian Conservation Corps. She immediately said, do Harrison Crandall, because Alice Hart, who was the curator at the time, was a fan of Crandall, like so many locals here in Jackson Hole, and knew that it was an important part of the park history as a historian herself. And so, but she didn't have time to do the research, and that was going to be my job. And so I took that project on from that moment forward.
Okay.
That was about 8 years ago.
Now, at that time, though, it wasn't a book idea yet. So as you did this research, you decided that there was a lot of material here, I'm guessing. And so how did the book idea have its genesis?
Well, I initially thought that it'd be nice if I could get an article in an academic journal, like Environmental Management, or one of the academic journals, usually about 10 pages with 4 or 5 photographs, and that's about all you're allowed in an academic journal. So I started the research, and that first summer, two things came to light. One was that there was a wealth of photographs in the Grand Teton National Park archives that had been in loose folders and not identified necessarily to any particular other aspect like correspondence in the folder. They were just loose photographs over the years stuck in these manila folders. And Alice allowed me to pull all of them out, get them in archival sleeves, and then we could study how many there were. These were black and white photos of the 5x7, 8x10 size, and some smaller ones. The other thing that came about is that Alice said, well, you know, you need to go over and talk to Herb and Keita Pownell, who lived close by to the park at the time at Paintbrush Point. And so I did that, and thank goodness Keita and Herb were gracious from the first moment, invited me into their house, and of course as I started to show interest in the name Crandall, they were only too happy to help me out. And they pulled out family albums, they pulled out old correspondence from the studio days, things that had been forgotten for many, many years from the public perspective. So that let me know that there was a lot of material, and it would take a number of years to get even that into the project, which I was calling Creating Vision of Grand Teton National Park. The park became more enthusiastic as we began to be able to collect up and interpret and archivally protect the images that were in their collection, and then understand the importance of them. So, but it built. Year after year, I'd go back to talk to Keita and Herb, and they would have another family album to show me or another box full of materials. And then eventually it came to light that there were 1,200 original negatives, Crandall negatives, and that the Pownells were storing for posterity. And they had been slightly damaged by the studio fire that occurred in 1954, been in storage ever since. And so as soon as I got to see those, we decided to scan them, and that made a lot more antique images that had never really been in the books that Crandall published or in the commercial materials really that he had sold in the shop. So that expanded the body of knowledge and information.
Okay. And what did you, in those negatives, did you see some things that had never been published before that were somewhat remarkable or memorable?
Yeah, there were many negatives of Native Americans. The Crandall family and Hank Crandall had gone to the powwows in Montana and Wyoming here. He was friendly with the natives, and they allowed him to photograph them. There were more than 100 images of the Native Americans. There were lots of movie actors. There were a lot of movies that had come through and were filmed here in Jackson Hole. And there were, I think the best, from my perspective, the one my smile got the largest when I saw them for the first time was a number of photos that had been taken of the entire Crandall family with Hildegard and Hank and Nancy and Keita on with horses, with cameras, standing in front of the Tetons, the favorite subject. So, and those are prominently displayed, of course, in the book.
Yes. And
they're one of my favorite
I
groups.
agree. I mean, I took note of those. I really enjoyed those, and we were just talking off camera a minute ago about just even the family photographs. He just had such a way of composing people and scenery and having it work to his advantage. But, you know, you have to, I think, have a natural love for the place to be able to do that with the ease that he did it. And that's what came through in your book anyway.
We're talking here about photographs, but it's important to remember that Hank thought of himself as a landscape painter. He was an artist with oil, making these wonderful oil paintings. Some of them were panoramics and very large canvases. Many of those, of course, have been sold around the country over the years. I have a map that shows virtually every state someone writing back a letter thanking Hank for their wonderful painting that they bought on a trip to the Tetons and when they had visited his studio. But having enough of those in one place in today to make a book out of it, and not just have a journal article, but a book, a color book. And so it took a while to gather up the images of the paintings, but it's important to remember that Hank thought of himself as a painter. So he was doing more than your average national park artist, because many of the people that we would refer to, like F.J. Haynes in Yellowstone, or Heilman or Marble at Glacier Park, even William Henry Jackson and Thomas Moran, were only doing one form of art, really, either photography or painting. But Hank Crandall did them both well. So that by itself is unique. Plus, he was a cinema photographer doing movies. He was a vaudeville-style actor. And all of these surprises kept coming up as we expanded our look at his life over time.
I have about 5 different directions I want to go with what you just said, but one of the questions I wanted to ask you was what was the most surprising thing you learned, something unexpected when you were writing this biography?
Well, I think there are a couple things that are worth noting. As a researcher, of course, you're looking for the Holy Grail, the one thing that makes everything fit together as a whole. And in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., actually College Park, Maryland, where they now have the National Archives for correspondence, my research there, I discovered a letter that was handwritten by Hank Crandall. Usually his letters were typed by Hildegard because she was a secretary, had trained secretarial skills, and almost all the letters were typed by Hilda, but this particular one had been handwritten by Hank and had been written to the director of the National Park Service at the time. And in that letter, Hank, in a paragraph, summarized his strong support for the expansion of the Grand Teton National Park here. As you know, a part of Horace Albright, the director of the Park Service at the time, and John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s plan to buy some ranches here in the valley and then eventually have that be part of the preserved land in the park.
And it was quite controversial. People were on one side of the question or the other in this valley.
Absolutely, and so Hank was clearly in support of the expansion of the park and gave emotional support to Horace Albright and the park managers at the time, as you say, at a time when it was not popular necessarily in Jackson Hole to be in favor of the buying up of these many ranches and then having that money, or having that land be donated back to the federal government. So, and that's a very interesting and important part of history here, that a few local people like Hank Crandall and others here who in the valley, just a few really that were publicly in favor, and they allowed the Park Service to know that. And I think that's one of the most important new facts that people reading the book will encounter. There's a whole chapter on Hank Crandall's patronage of the park, and I had seen that the Park Service itself uses that term, patron of the park, in their website. But I was looking for the Holy Grail. Why was he the patron? He did sell the homestead to the Snake River Land Company. He did donate many paintings and photographs to the Park Service to help with the initial park bill in 1929 and the expansion later. So he was doing a lot of things as a concessionaire that the Park Service liked, but it was that support, that letter of support, that acknowledged that he was working very closely with Horace Albright, who was a major figure in the early park movement as the second director. And actually, I think history will record that as, in fact, Horace Albright himself, in eulogizing Hank, said that Hank would figure prominently in the Grand Teton National Park history. And that letter sort of shows everybody in concrete terms that where Hank was standing on this issue. Of course, he couldn't be as public as some others in the valley because he depended on people coming to his studio. He didn't have a large bank account to rest on. He had to sell things every day. And so I think that is the biggest surprise, that I was able to uncover that in the National Archives. And I do talk about that in the book some, so that people can get a sense of how this important artist figured prominently in the early national park movement, when in fact there weren't very many people in the Park Service yet. And I think Horace Albright will be recorded as a much more important figure in the early park movement than we currently give him credit for.
And Teton Park